The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Thursday, May 15th. I hope everybody has had a good week. As you can see, I'm still on the road. I am in New York for another couple of days, then off to London. And I will be probably doing the next show from London probably on Sunday. All right, we have got a stacked show today. Lots of topics to cover. So we're going to get right to it. I will remind you that we do have, I do still have questions from yesterday that I'm going to cover, but keep asking questions, particularly at the $20, $50, $100 level, to keep funding and supporting the show, a show made possible through the support of people like you. All right, so let's jump in. All right, so we're going to start today, and usually, with some good news, some really good news. Good news from the Trump administration, nonetheless. And this is something that happened a few weeks ago, but in the flurry of executive orders that the Trump administration has embraced, it's hard to keep track of everything that's being done. But this one is important, and this executive order is important. It's significant. It's not unfortunately as significant as it could be, because that would require, again, legislation, that horrible thing. But it is definitely a step in the right direction, and it could have real ripple effects and ultimately could result in legislation that would make a real difference in Americans' lives. And, this is kind of an extension of the other really, really good thing that I think Trump has done through executive order, again, that has not received much press, and that is doing away with affirmative action, which, if you remember, when that executive order passed, I said that it was probably the best thing that Trump was going to do. Well, this is in support of that, if you will, and that is Executive Order 14281, which basically targets the judicial doctrine of disparate impact. That is one more of the effects, you could say unintended effects, but maybe predictable effects of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, what does disparate impact mean? Well, it's a doctrine that came out of a Supreme Court case in 1971 called Griggs versus Duke Power Company. I've talked about this in the past on one of the shows that I did in the past about, after BLM and everything that came out of that. And because it really is the source of the whole equity perspective, the perspective of really systemic racism. The perspective of systemic racism comes as a, long-term consequence of this case. So this is a case in which civil rights groups argued that black voters at a North Carolina utility, that is Duke Power, were not being promoted quickly enough. And Duke Power said, look, we give everybody a test, and the results of this test are that 58% of whites pass the test, only 6% of blacks pass the test, and this test is a prerequisite for promotion, and therefore more whites are promoted than blacks. Much more whites, many, many, many more whites are promoted than blacks. And this is a respectable test. It wasn't perceived as the test was a way in which Duke Power was going to discriminate. The justice's view was Duke Power was not trying to discriminate. But the result was that blacks in management were underrepresented at Duke Power as compared to the percentage of the black population in North Carolina. And this is disparate impact. So this test had an impact of creating a disparity in its outcome between the outcome and between the relative percentages in the population more generally. And so, so the justice says, the test is okay, but do the job qualifications really need this test? And the reality is that this test is winnowing the workforce along racial lines. And they made the assessment. It's kind of interesting. The court would make this assessment. They made the assessment that the company didn't really need this test in order to vet higher level employees. Right? So the court here is not running businesses or telling businesses how to run themselves. So the justices voted unanimously to disallow such tests. And I quote, notwithstanding the employer's lack of discriminatory intent. So this is really bad law. So you could be convicted of discrimination without having discriminatory intent, without intending discrimination. And that makes the law arbitrary. Well, how do you decide if discrimination is, what does it even mean to discriminate if I didn't intend to discriminate? Every court had to perform a three-part, by the way, this is from a Free Press article that brings up this issue, a really good article. So each court has to perform a three-part judicial test to figure out whether any given hire was illegal under Griggs, and not just hire, any management practice. And what are the three decisions? They had to find out whether this was bad for blacks or a minority, then whether the qualifications it measured were job related. So is the test or the business procedure or whatever, the business practice, is it job related, and whether there were alternatives, were there other ways of getting the same result, achieving the business practice. So judges were in a position now to decide business practices and whether they were good and job related and so on. So they were placing themselves in the position of a business leader, which they have no qualifications to make, no qualifications to decide. But they're now in the business, right, of business. And they couldn't decide these things. So basically, and businesses, of course, companies, of course, were really worried about lawsuits. So they were worried about any business hiring could lead to a lawsuit. So what the businesses engaged in, voluntarily, right, was to set quotas for minorities that were roughly equal to the percentage of the minority in the local population to offset, to in a sense, kind of prevent a lawsuit from even happening. The other way was to set criteria that were strictly based on credentials. Not on qualifications, but on credentials. Credentials being perceived by the courts as being something objective, right? So you can no longer safely give a break to a talented person and who might have gotten bad grades in high school or college, but still talented, because then that could skew the racial makeup of your workforce. So you could only do it if that person was a minority, and you could instead of that just go by credentials alone, and then you could make an exception. couldn't hire by word of mouth. You couldn't generally engage in the hiring practices that people have engaged in for a very, very, very long time. Now, through the decades, disparate income impact doctrine spread from one area of American life to another. The campaign against redlining in 1994, where there was no redlining, assumed there was systemic racism going on. Why? Because whites were getting more mortgages than blacks. They couldn't prove discrimination because there might have been economic reasons to give or credit risk reasons to give in any particular area more mortgages to whites than blacks. But because the outcome was inconsistent with, the idea that everybody should be represented the same as they were represented in the population, banks were then, forced into creating all kinds of the Community Reinvestment Act, all kinds of ways in which they could compensate for the fact that they were disproportionately harming minority populations. So creditworthiness was ignored as an explanation for the disparity. All that you want is the result. And if the result means more whites are getting than blacks or more whites are getting than Hispanics, then the outcome, the impact, is discriminatory, viewed as discriminatory, whether the intention was to discriminate or not. Again, intention doesn't matter. Now, even though even the New York Times at the time completely debunked the whole idea of redlining, it didn't matter. This disparate impact, the outcome-based, which is really, if you think about it, it's just egalitarianism. It's another form of egalitarianism, right? We want the outcome to be the same, the outcome to be equal. Now, you could argue that the consequence of this played all the way out even into the 2008 financial crisis, the whole anti-redlining perspective. And you can see how this filtered into every aspect of police hiring and into business, into banking. In every aspect, your actions were determined to be legit or not based on whether the outcome was the same across racial groups, which is basically racism. And you had to correct that by, in a sense, setting kind of quotas. Well, the 10% of blacks in the population, we need to make sure that 10% of the mortgages are given to blacks. Now, more broadly, what this really led to was the whole equity movement. The whole movement that said, well, this just proves that there's systemic racism in America because the outcomes of America are not equal. Blacks represent X percent of the population, but they don't have that percent of the wealth. So they must be being discriminated against. The outcome has to be equality. So blacks as a population, again, collectivism, but blacks as a population need to have exactly the same characteristics in terms of wealth distribution, in terms of income, as whites. This became the thrust of, if you remember, Ibram Kendi's whole campaign, so-called anti-racism campaign. They turned the disparate income, this narrow feature, into this universal principle of egalitarianism, of equality, of outcome. And it doesn't matter, for example, if you are a racist. It doesn't matter if you intend to be racist. If the outcome is unequal, then there has to be racism there. One race is being preferred to another, therefore it has to be motivated by racism. If you remember the BLM days, this is exactly the argument, the exact argument. And then the consequence of that is, in order to cure us of this systemic racism, of this implicit racism, we have to take into account race in order to undo the consequences of this embedded, systemic, implicit, unconscious racism that exists in our culture. And he wrote this. So, for example, this is Kendi in his book How to Be an Anti-Racist. The only remedy to racist discrimination and anti-racist discrimination, right? And this is the real anti-racist discrimination. So being an anti-racist is discriminatory in and of itself because you're denying the fact that you are racist. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. That is what some people call reverse racism. So this is the consequence of this legal doctrine of disparate outcome that came down from Grigg versus Duke. Now, this executive order is trying to combat that and trying to reverse that. But and it's going to filter through the system. How much impact it's going to have, it's hard to tell. But it does seem like companies, and I think the courts are going to take a different look at disparate income, disparate impact. Now, there's some complications because in 1991, there was a bill passed under George H.W. Bush called the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which introduced disparate income into the letter of the law. To really get rid of disparate income, you would have to get rid of that law. You would have to have legislation to reverse that, and it doesn't seem like Republicans or Democrats have any appetite for doing that. But it is good that the executive branch is at least not going to use these kind of arguments for the Justice Department to sue, for the Justice Department to go after people. This is going to be, the executive order basically tells the Justice Department not to take these kind of considerations into account. And that is good. To get completely rid of it in all sectors and throughout the economy, throughout our lives, you would have to reverse the 1991 Civil Rights Act. So on these cultural issues, on these issues of, you could call it the abuse of the civil rights law, although the civil rights law, because it prohibits private discrimination, creates these flaws built in, and affirmative action and this disparate income are just impacted just ways of applying the law, flawed ways of applying the law. But on this issue, it seems like the Trump administration or people in the Trump administration, I don't think Trump knows what disparate income is, but the people in the Trump administration that figured out a strategy based on the work of people like Richard Hanania and others of how to try to start unwinding the effects of the civil rights law on DEI. I mean, this is just another pillar of DEI, which is equity. This is the equity piece. And affirmative action was a diversity piece. And they're related and they're kind of the same, but the equity piece has kind of a moral component to it and an explicit egalitarianism to it. And so by going after affirmative action, going after disparate impact, they're trying to attack DEI at its source, at its core, at its beginning. And for that, they should be commended. It's sad that it's coming from as ugly as an administration as the Trump administration, and ultimately a lot of this stuff could be undone by future administrations because it's all happening by executive order. But again, this is good stuff, and we should recognize positive movements when they happen. It's the kind of stuff I think that Larry Salzman in the interview last Saturday was talking about with regard to administrative law, with regard to the law of the regulatory bodies. It's the same kind of thing applied to now the Civil Rights Act and the DEI, the whole DEI phenomena. They're trying to go to the core of it, to the heart of it, and trying to dismantle the whole structure of it. And again, as such, that is a positive. That is a good thing. All right, now let's go to a negative. Let me just find this out here. Whoops, what happened? That's not it. Yeah. So this happened last Friday, about a week ago. Stephen Miller, who is kind of one of the top advisors to Donald Trump, came on and this is what he said, right? This is what he said. Quote, "Well, the Constitution is clear. In terms of, it's clear in terms of how we, of suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, is the right to challenge one's detention in court. Habeas corpus has roots in, the common law in England. It's 1,000 years old or something. Anyway, Miller's saying it can be suspended, and this is how he says it. Well, the Constitution is clear. The Supreme Court of the land, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. That the privilege, note the word privilege, that the privilege of writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion. So that's an option we're actively looking at. Look, a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not. So think about this. First of all, writ of habeas corpus is not a privilege. It's quite an interpretation of the Bill of Rights. I mean, it's not a Bill of Privileges. It's a Bill of Rights. Habeas corpus has always been viewed as a right to challenge your detention, a right to demand of the government to justify why they're detaining you, why they're using force against you. Again, to view as anything in the Constitution as a privilege, which means the state is the primary, and then it gives you the privilege of speech, of free speech. It's a privilege, and we can take it away. We give you the privilege of demanding, right, an explanation for why you're being detained in a court, but we can take it away. That is, the starting point is not the individual as being free, the individual as having freedom of action, free of coercion and force. The starting point is the state. And then, an efficient state, a good state, a benevolent state, gives some privileges to its people. It allows them to be free out of a sense of, that kind of makes sense. But there's no right to be free, according to Miller. So literally last Friday, a senior official in the United States said that suspending the writ of habeas corpus was an option they were looking at, taking away that privilege that you guys all have, thinking you're free. Oh no, you're only free because the government has chosen to leave you free. And they can change their mind at any time. And this is one example of that. And in this case, the writ of habeas corpus can be taken away in a time of invasion. And of course, this is all based on the idea that immigration is an invasion. Immigration being legal or illegal in this case, is an invasion. Now, that one is a tough one to I think, ultimately, to be able to convince the courts of. In the Constitution, it says in cases of rebellion or invasion. But those terms have been universally understood to mean military conflict or war. John Woo, who is a conservative former clerk to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, and if you remember, he was the guy who the Bush administration, he wrote the memo for the Bush administration justifying the use of torture after 9/11. So John Woo is not some liberal leftist thing, and he's saying that this ability to suspend habeas corpus wouldn't apply in a case of immigration at all. There's zero chance that that would fly in the courts. This administration, in the name of dealing with immigration, which seems to be one of the two biggest issues that they care about, is willing to just suspend the Constitution, ignore the Constitution, or ignore any kind of reasonable reading of the Constitution. Now, luckily, I don't think the courts will do that. I think if they do decide to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, I think there will be a huge uproar, and I think it'll go to court, and I think it'll be thrown out of court. But everything takes time. While this is in the courts, people's rights are going to be abused. And if by chance the courts allow them this, then, yeah, right now they'll only use the writ of habeas corpus against what they think are illegal immigrants, but who might be legal immigrants. And since they won't get an opportunity to challenge their detention in court, who knows? And then, who knows what the next application of the suspension of habeas corpus is going to be. Slippery slopes do indeed exist. Statist slippery slopes have existed forever. And, the state of the world today is proof of that. Now, if a court decided that this was unconstitutional, would Trump succumb to what the court decides or not? There was an interesting argument today in the courts. Today in the Supreme Court, they were deciding. There was a discussion of whether district courts could do these injunctions, nationwide injunctions, and I think the conclusion is no. The Supreme Court is going to come down against that. But Barrett at some point asks the lawyer representing the government, representing the Trump administration, she asks him something like, does the Trump administration obligated to follow a ruling of an appellate court, of a district court? And he basically said mostly. And she was like, mostly? Not always? And he said, no, not always. And she says, has this always been the view of the Justice Department? And he said, yes. And she says, are you sure? And it's kind of, how would you decide? Well, based on the president and, whether he thinks this is right or whether he thinks this is wrong. It's the president gets to decide whether to follow what the courts are saying. And he did say, we would always follow what the Supreme Court said. But he suggested that they would be willing to violate a court order from an appellate court. So it's going to be interesting to what extent Trump is really committed to following the courts and what kind of advice he's getting. We will see. But this suspension of writ of habeas corpus is a big deal. The idea that we're being invaded empties the concept of invasion of any content. There is no content. There's no content around, there's no meaning to invasion if immigration counts as invasion. Invasion is an act of military offensive. It is an act of one state against another. People don't invade, states invade. So it is a complete negation of the concept of invasion. And it's going to be interesting to see how the courts approach this, and what they do with it. And because a lot of the whole Aliens Enemies Act the application of the Aliens Enemies Act is in the context of an invasion. So, and there they make the argument that the invasion is guided by certain countries. So the Supreme Court is going to have lots of opportunities to be able to address this issue of whether immigration, illegal immigration, is an act of invasion or not. Hopefully they take the right side of this and they rule that it is not appropriate application, and they rule that a lot of the immigration policies that the Trump administration has embraced are unconstitutional. And that will take the wind out of even the suggestion of suspending the writ of habeas corpus. But the problem with these things is it could take months before these cases appear before the Supreme Court. Okay, a few other stories. I think many of these are going to be pretty short. Let me do the budget first, and then we'll do California insurance. Budget. This is from I saw this from Alex Epstein. So Alex has been arguing for the last few weeks and trying to influence Congress and the administration that as part of this big, beautiful budget deal that Congress is passing, that we talked about yesterday, how it's going to massively blow up the national debt. But as part of that, Alex has been arguing from the perspective of energy. And by the way, don't forget, Alex is a sponsor of this show, and you should subscribe to his Substack at alexepstein.substack.com. But he has been arguing that as part of this bill, Congress should terminate completely all of the Inflation Reduction Act. This is the big bill that Biden passed. All of the subsidies for solar and wind, just all of them should be gone immediately. And this would indeed be a way to cut government spending, which the Republicans claim they want to do. So why keep these? What is the Republican incentive? Clearly we have an energy secretary that's less interested in wind and solar. So Congress just cut wind and solar. And we now have a kind of draft of the proposed budget, and they're not actually doing it. So as Alex writes, Republicans ran on a pledge to terminate the $1 trillion Inflation Reduction Act subsidies that were called the Green New Scam, or I think Alex called them the Green New Scam. Or Republicans called it that, maybe influenced by Alex. But their proposed budget keeps almost all the subsidies, while falsely claiming to save money through easily reversed phase-outs that start in 4 years. That's a new Congress in 4 years, a new Senate in 4 years, maybe a new president in 4 years. I mean, Republicans are real cowards. I mean, real cowards. This is easy. Should be really, really easy. I mean, all of them should be fully repealed. You know, if reading from Alex again, it is possible that some sort of compromise is absolutely necessary to repeal most of the Inflation Reduction Act. However, the current proposal from the House Ways and Means does not repeal the IRA subsidies in any meaningful way due to three fatal flaws. One, the overwhelming majority of the bill's savings are based not on truly ending subsidies now, but on empty promises of phase-outs that start 4 years in the future and can easily be reversed by future Congresses. Multiple tax credits, including the most expensive and destructive solar, wind, ITC, and PTC, aren't being eliminated, only phased out starting 4 or more years from now. Hence, the overwhelming majority of the bill's savings have no chance of happening in the near future. Only 3% of PTCs, that's one of these subsidies, savings, and 26% of ITC's planned savings. All of it's just piecemeal. The rest of it starting in 2030. That's 3 Congresses from now, and when Trump will be out of office. So why phase it out? Why not just terminate it and then force future Congresses, if they want, to add it? But that's much more difficult than just to stop the phase out and to push it into 4 years where you can just reverse yourself on that. So this is just cowardice. They have the power, they have the votes, and it's the consequence of the fact that big wind and big solar are lobbying and spending a lot of money lobbying. And the Republicans, again, are cowards and not even willing to do what they promised to do, which is eliminate, stop. I mean, the first thing a decent president would do if they came to office, a really good president would do if they came to office, the first thing you would do, in my view, is end all subsidies to business, end all subsidies to farmers, end all subsidies to productive endeavors, and then at the same time start deregulating, eliminating regulations. But that should be the most important thing if you care about freedom, economic freedom, if you care about markets. Get rid of the distortions of subsidies and start the hard work of significant deregulation. These Republicans, again, they have the House, they have the Senate, they have the White House. This bill does not need 60 votes in the Senate. They've got the votes in the Senate. They can't even do this. They can't even get rid of subsidies for solar and wind, which Trump rails against. Certainly the Energy Secretary is vehemently against, and Congress just can't do it. I mean, it's hard to imagine what hope we have if Congress is really this pathetic. By the way, they've taken away subsidies for residential solar because there's nobody to lobby there. And they've kept the subsidies for big solar because there's a lobby group right there. All right. Let me just see where we are. All right, let me remind you all that this show is funded from support from you guys. A big chunk of that support comes from Super Chat. So please consider asking questions. I've got a lot of $5 and $10 questions, $2 questions. If you can, $20 questions, $50 questions, that also help us get to a goal of $250 an hour. So trade, value for value. So if you can. And now if you can't do that, then feel free to do stickers at any amount you want. Any amount that you can, any amount that you think is a value in exchange for what you're getting from the show. Please consider doing a sticker. A sticker is not a question. I, again, today have a hard stop, so I can't have 100 more $2 questions. I just won't have the time to get through them all. But stickers don't take up time, so, go for it. Let's see. Yeah, so you remember the fires in California that just devastated LA and Southern California? Were just horrific. And part of that was a consequence of the fact that insurers were not allowed to determine rates, determine appropriate rates. I mean, that didn't cause the fire, but that caused a lot of people to be uninsured or underinsured. And it eliminated price as a mechanism to determine people's incentives to live in a particular place or to build in a particular place. If rates are really cheap, people will build, people will live there. If rates are high, fewer people are going to build, fewer people are going to live there. And they're high because the fire risk is high. Well, California prevented the insurance companies from actually having high rates. Now, we talked about this at the time, how this completely distorts and perverts the market, perverts incentives both for development and for people buying property, and being concerned about fires. They're just not getting the pricing signal, the signal from the market about the true risk that they're engaged in. Well, California has decided to finally allow State Farm to raise insurance rates on homeowners. Right? And, you know, it's good for California. Positive move in the right direction. And of course, all the left is pissed off and upset and thinks this is a complete and utter travesty, right? So they never learn. They don't understand markets. They don't understand what freedom allows. They don't understand, or maybe they do understand, they don't care, how their policies cause the disasters. The disaster is not the fire. The disaster is the homes burnt by the fire. California could also invest in ways to protect itself from fires, like clearing lanes, getting rid of the environmental regulations that prevent them from clearing paths, using better technology in order to fight fires and so on. But that ain't happening, unfortunately. So yes, finally, an insurance company in California has been allowed, this is statism, allowed to raise rates. All right. We did that. All right, quickly, 23andMe. I don't know how many of you are familiar with 23andMe. It's a company that started years ago and promised this to completely revolutionize genetic testing and be at the forefront of personalized medicine. I remember sending in, they had you spit into a test tube and you send it in, and they gave you a DNA profile. I did this really early on before the regulators climbed on 23andMe's back. And they give you a plethora of information, part of it about your ancestors and stuff like that, which is just kind of interesting, but of no real value. And part of it about susceptibility to diseases and things like that, which actually has great value because you can actually take steps around that. And it was a real benefit, but at some point they were forced to take everything off their website, all the information that they provided us, and they had to apply to the regulators, the FDA, in order to get certified to be able to provide any kind of information to the people who had submitted their samples. And this took, I can't remember how many it took, months, years, I can't remember. And then they came back with a much reduced genetic profile in terms of what they were allowed to say, what were they allowed to tell you about your own genes. And they've never been the same since then. They've never been the same since then. And indeed, 23andMe, which has the data, genetic data for 15 million people, including mine, filed for bankruptcy. A while ago. And right now, a judge is deciding what can be done with the data. Right? They have a database of the genome of 15 million people. And the question is, can they sell it? Now, a judge just ruled that indeed they can. They can sell the data to potential bidders. I'm sure that when we gave them our samples, we signed something that gave them the right to sell the data for certain uses. I'm sure for other uses, no. So it's, genetic privacy laws are pretty weak. This is a big issue, and a lot of customers are afraid and concerned about how their data will be used and who gets the data, who it's going to be sold to. Now, my assumption is it's going to be sold to somebody who can use this data for medical research, which was part of the intent of gathering this data. 23andMe was going to make money by doing research based on all this data, correlating it with diseases, and then selling the conclusions or pieces of the data to pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies because this data is incredibly valuable. So, it's going to be interesting to see how all this plays out and who actually buys this data. But we also need much more clarity around ownership of these things. Who actually owns? Once you give, once you spit into the test tube, have you given up the rights to that data? Is signing one of those documents enough to basically give up the right to any use of that data? It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, and it would be valuable if we actually had a worthwhile legislature, if we actually had a functioning Congress that actually cared about individual rights. This would be a good topic for new legislation, for actually clarifying, what is the status of my DNA? Do I own the data that is encoded in my DNA? Or have I given it up once I have somebody, sequences and provide me with the information? To what extent are those, again, privacy documents that we all sign probably without reading, to what extent are those legit? Or what extent do those actually cover these cases? It seems like this judge specifically thinks, no, this data can be sold. You've given all right to it. Anybody can take it. That is going to be interesting. All right. Okay, quickly, a few foreign policy issues. Iran. So it definitely looks like they're getting close to a deal with Iran. So President Trump, on his trip to Saudi Arabia, has indicated a number of times that they're close, that a deal that basically allows the Iranians to continue with their civil nuclear program, the kind of program that the United States is going to work with the Saudis to give to Saudi Arabia, or to help develop in Saudi Arabia, that will be continued in Iran, and in exchange, the United States will lift all sanctions, and there will be full-blown trade with Iran. Of course, that would provide billions and billions and billions of dollars for the Iranians, because they would be selling oil freely on the world market, which they cannot do today. The consequence of that are, one, the Iranians will have lots of money, and we know what they spend it on. At least a portion of that money goes to terrorists of all kinds. I think we talked about the fact that the British arrested a bunch of Iranians a few weeks ago who had intentions to blow up certain targets within London. So, everything that they blamed the Biden administration for providing funds that were then used to fund Hamas and to fund terrorists, my guess is that the Trump administration is going to do the same thing, unless they have something in this deal that prohibits the Iranians from funding the Houthis and the Hamases and the all the other terrorist networks around the world, which I find hard to believe that would actually happen. So that's one consequence. Second consequence is, at least in the short run, the expectation is that oil prices will come down, because suddenly you'll have significant additional supply on the market, and oil prices will come down even more. So prices are already down. Brent oil on a per barrel basis lost as much as 3.4% just on the rumor that a deal is going to be cut, because everybody's expecting a glut of supply. In the United States, the U.S. has shown that there are significant stockpiles of oil, so there's plenty of oil in the market right now. Prices are coming down. This will not encourage Americans to drill. We've talked about this otherwise. Anyway, it seems like a deal is going to happen. And this will be a significant blow to Israel. It'll be a significant blow to, I think, the West more broadly. It'll be a huge benefit to the various terrorist groups around the world that get funding from the Iranians. We'll see if there's any provisioning in this deal when it comes out for not funding terrorist organizations, and how the Trump administration is going to monitor their ability to live up to that. Let's see, Ukraine. There was all this talk about direct talks between Ukraine and Russia, and I think Putin suggested that face-to-face direct talks between Russia and Ukraine happened, and Zelensky said, and then Trump supported that, and then Zelensky said, okay, I'm going to go to Turkey on Thursday, and if Putin shows up, we'll sit down and start negotiating. And he flew to Turkey, and he's sitting there waiting for Putin to show up. And today, early on Thursday morning in Europe, Putin announced that no, he's not going. Instead, he is sending two pretty junior people from Russia to go and negotiate with Zelensky. Zelensky then said he will send somebody to those negotiations. It's not going to be him. Trump at some point said, if Putin's going to show up in Turkey to sit down with Zelensky, I'll come as well, and we can have a sit down and talk about peace. But we all know, I don't know if we all know, but it's quite obvious and has been forever that Putin is not interested in a ceasefire, is not interested in peace. There's also supposed to be a ceasefire that started, 2 days ago? And that has not happened. But there's just no intention of the Russians to actually reach a deal. And this is more of a slap in the face for Trump's foreign policy. The fact that he drew this moral equivocation equivalency between Putin and Zelensky, between Russia and Ukraine, or worse, that he actually supported Russia over Ukraine with the idea that, oh no, the Russians want peace, it's the Ukrainians that are insisting on war, has been shown to be complete BS. And now we'll see. The war will continue, I expect, although there will be some talks in Turkey over a peace deal that I expect will amount to nothing, because we know what Putin wants. He wants a complete surrender of Ukraine and taking over all the territory that he has demanded from the beginning. That's what he demands. And I don't think Ukraine is going to agree to give that up. And I think the Europeans will back him up. And no matter what Trump wants, or no matter what Trump says, I think that Ukraine is going to stand strong and not compromise. Well, it might compromise somewhat, but it's not going to completely give up. It's not going to completely surrender to Putin's demands. Okay. Let's see. There's a really interesting piece in the Free Press on Qatar. So the Free Press has done a deep dive into thousands of lobbying, real estate, and corporate filings. And what they've discovered is that the government of Qatar has spent almost $100 billion, not million, $100 billion, to influence Congress, American colleges and universities, US newsrooms, think tanks, and corporations. Over the last 20 years, it's poured billions into purchasing everything from weapon systems from the US to making business investments ranging from US real estate to energy plants. It, of course, helped build the largest Air Force base that America has in the Middle East on Qatari territory, that way bonding itself to the American military, even as that base was being used to bomb people it was funding, like ISIS and other groups in Syria, Iraq, and even Afghanistan. Qatar finances research on campuses. It finances, the most prestigious American universities get significant, the largest funder of American universities, the largest single funder of American universities is the Qatari government. And they have more lobbyists than almost anybody, right? And they spent $225 million on lobbying and public relations efforts in the Capitol, in DC, just since 2017, over the last 8 years, $225 million on lobbying. the Free Press estimates that this influence campaign is without any modern parallel, that nobody else is even close in terms of the amount of money. There's also a story, by the way, in the Wall Street Journal today about the same topic. The Qataris are embedded in the United States, and they've spent huge amounts of money in order to do that. Now, they've also influenced Israel. There's a big scandal in Israel right now of two people who work in Netanyahu's prime minister's office, who were receiving money from the Qatari government to basically lobby on their behalf within Israel, even though none of that was disclosed. Qatar has been, of course, the intermediary between Israel and Hamas. Qatar has also been an intermediary in the past between the United States and Iran. This is a regime that, wants to have its cake and eat it. It supports terrorism on the one hand, but it also heavily invests in the United States. It invests in the Islamists, in Islamist regimes, in Islamist terrorist organizations. I think there was a period where it provided more money to Hamas than even Iran did, and to Hezbollah, and yet it poured $100 billion into the United States. They have their hands in everything. And of course, yesterday, Donald Trump was in Qatar. He, I think, has accepted the $400 million plane as a gift to him. This is a plane that is decked out like a palace inside. It's for kings, which is perfect for Trump. Anyway, this is, and Qatar should have been, a long time ago, defined as the enemy, because it funds the enemy, it supports the enemy, and yet it's being treated in the United States like a friend, and of course it's being treated like a friend. It spent $100 billion to earn that friendship, or to bribe us into that friendship. I don't think this is going to end well. I'm just putting it out there as a prediction. Our involvement with Qatar will not end well. And the Qatari regime, not honest, good actors. And we're going to pay a price for how we're helping them out and supporting them. Finally, a quick one on China. So China is launching a big dedicated recruitment program to try to lure Chinese-born researchers who are working in the United States, trying to lure them back to China. They're offering a lot of money, for research, salaries, prestige. This is at a time when there are massive funding cuts for research across the board at American universities because of the Trump administration, and general increase in suspicion of foreigners across the board in the United States, and an unease among those who are not American-born. And, in Beijing, they're putting together a really attractive postdoctoral positions to attract people who are early in their careers, but also offers for more senior people who are researchers. A lot of Chinese come to America, get their STEM degrees here, and stay and do research. Some of the leading researchers in all kinds of fields are originally from China. They become Americans. But the ever-growing suspicion against them, the lack of funding, the Chinese are going to take advantage of that. I have always said one of the things that America could do in order to weaken China is basically to give visas to anybody who wants to come here from China, let's say who has an advanced degree in STEM, invite over all their scientists and engineers, create a brain drain out of China into the United States. Well, the Chinese must have been listening to the show, and they figure they can do a reverse brain drain. They could empty the United States of at least the Chinese, some of the most talented researchers that we have here who are of Chinese origin, and get them to move back to China. For postdocs, some of the offers are approaching $100,000 a year, which is a lot of money in China, and a lot of money for a postdoc. and of course, funding for the research. So, yeah, China is following through on my plan to help create a brain drain. But who thought the brain drain would go in the direction of from the U.S. to China, not the other way around? You'd think that people would want to come to freedom, and they do, if we live up to those values. If we live up to those values. All right, that is the news for this Thursday, May 15th, and I will now take your questions. I will remind you, that today is the last day for this big discount for Ocon. You can get 25% off, I believe, if you register today for Ocon. I think at midnight today, this is over. It's a pop-up special. If you register for Ocon, I think to register for Ocon, you can go to /, start here. That's the wrong one. Wait a second. What am I looking for? This. Okay, it's this flash sale, 25% off. I have a code here. I thought I had a code. Yes, 25, flash, the word flash, 20. And it's not a 25%, it's a 20% discount. You get a 20% discount on your registration for Ocon. And that's for in person, if you're actually going to go to the conference. If you want to stay home and watch the events live on the internet, you can still get the Yaron Brook show special discount for the virtual pass, and that's 25 YBS 10. So for the 20% off flash in person, 25 flash 20. For the 10% virtual pass or day pass, you can get 25 YBS 10. So those are the passes. You should all come to Ocon. We're going to have a lot of fun. It'll be a blast. Great talks, great socializing, good poker, good event all around. A lot of fun. All right, let's do the super chat. I've got a bunch of questions from last time and a few questions from today. Not many, so stickers or more questions, guys, particularly $20 questions as a value for value. And of course, one way in which you could help the show a lot, and we'll again express that idea of a trade, is by going to Patreon and becoming a monthly supporter. Patreon.com, and just search for Yaron Brook Show. And Armin just came in with $100. Thank you, Armin. Really appreciate the support. It's good to see you here. All right, let's start with James. Have you heard of black fatigue? No. It is people saying they are tired of black people. It is rapidly spreading. How will this inspire ideas for the alt-right and leftists? Do you see the United States becoming more hostile or open to minorities? Well, I think we're clearly becoming more hostile to minorities. I think that we have been elevating race as a gender item, as important in our lives. We've been elevating that for years now, for really over the last 15 years. It started with the left and the whole, agenda of, anti-racism, which is Kendi, which is more recent, but the whole DEI agenda, the whole diversity and equity agenda, which is basically a racist agenda, which is basically evaluating people based on race. That goes back to the intersectionality. It goes back to the whole leftist agenda of the last 15 to 20 years. And I think that peaked with BLM, that was its greatest power. And over the last 2, 3, 4 years, it's been in decline. And I think Donald Trump winning was the ultimate blow, to that. But I think that, so you're asking, so I think that the thinking of people in terms of race and evaluating them in terms of race and judging people based on race, that is only intensifying, but now it intensified from the left, and now it shifted to the right, and now you're seeing a rise from the right. And I remember saying over and over again 5, 6, 7 years ago, certainly during the BLM riots, that the left's elevation of race to such an important place in our culture is only going to cause a backlash from the right. And the backlash from the right will be a racist backlash from the right. So what we've seen now is the shift from racism as a feature of the far left to now racism as a feature of the far right, a feature of the far right that's really being embraced by many elements within the right. We talked about, the South African asylum seekers yesterday and how that is reflective of a racist policy, right? If you're an asylum seeker from South Africa, we give you the red carpet treatment. If you're an asylum seeker from Latin America, no, we have no interest in you. Go to hell. Even though the regimes in Latin America, many of those regimes are much worse than the regime in South Africa. So unless we embrace individualism, real individualism, treating people as individuals, unless we embrace even Martin Luther King's individualism, or the idea of treating people based on their character, not based on the color of their skin, you're only going to see more racism, more hostility towards minorities in the culture, because I think the right is at least in parts of the right, big parts of the right, racist elements are becoming legitimized. And that's a big chunk of the population. Racism is being legitimized. And at far left, racism is legitimized already. Now it's not just the far right, it's the far right ever expanding into the much more mainstream right elements of racism. So black fatigue, yeah, I can see that. It's partially leftist fatigue. They associate the two. And it's part of this legitimization of racism. Evan, hey Yaron, great show so far, minor point. The language, the privilege of writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended. The word privilege comes directly from the Constitution, not purely an invention of Miller. Okay, well in that case, I appreciate that correction. In that case, the Constitution, there's a small flaw in the Constitution. I mean, not a small flaw, a significant flaw. It's not a privilege. Now, it could be that the founders understood privilege in a different way, but it's not a privilege, it's a right. And again, the Bill of Rights has provisions, the Fifth Amendment, others, that kind of protect this privilege. But I know how Miller uses the term privilege. It's something that can easily be taken away. It's something that the government grants you. I doubt if that's how the founders understood this. I mean, maybe some of you, know the Constitution better than I do in terms of how the founders might have interpreted that. But yeah, thanks, Evan, for correcting me. I apologize for making that error. And it's a confounding one because I'm not sure I understand why the founders would use such a term. But again, I'm not sure what they understood privilege to mean. Andrew, is there an invasion? If there is an invasion, then emergency powers can be enacted. They have been enacted. Trump has enacted them. If the climate is in crisis, then they can control all aspects of our lives on an emergency basis. And they have, right? They've used climate as an emergency in order to pass certain executive orders. Their feelings distort concepts, which then distort politics. Well, it's not even, it's feelings at the core of it, but look, they have issues that they care about, immigration, climate, and they're using the terminology of emergency in order to get their agenda across in an anti-constitutional way. and they're appealing to people's emotions. That is the reason they can get away with it, is because they've, in the case of Trump, he spent the last 8 years scaring people to death about immigrants. Or in the case of the left, they've spent the last 30 years scaring to death everybody about climate change. And then it makes sense to people completely. Oh yeah, it's an emergency. I mean, we've been told it's an emergency in kind of other words over and over and over and over again. So yeah, an emergency. So it's an appeal to the voters' emotions and why the voters are willing to tolerate this kind of behavior from their politicians. The politicians themselves know exactly what they're doing. They have an anti-immigration agenda, figure out how to turn it into an emergency. All right, let's see. Andrew again. Can one live a good life, say in China, if not allowed to criticize nor hear criticism of the government? There must always be a pit of fear within. Is the uniform praise of Trump from the right a step to barring criticism? Can one live a good life? I mean, up to a point, yes. I mean, you're not going to live a completely good life. You're not going to, just like even in a mixed economy, you can't live a completely good life. But look, in comparison to what? I mean, from an average Chinese perspective, their parents and their grandparents grew up under Mao Zedong, where not only couldn't they criticize the government, but they were also dirt poor, and they had nothing. And they were destined to continue to be dirt poor and to continue to have nothing. They had no property rights, they had nothing. That was a unequivocally, completely miserable life. Over the last 40 years, China has embraced what I call pseudo property rights. They've embraced some economic freedoms, and a vast number, hundreds of millions of people within China have achieved middle class and even wealth. Are those people living a good life? Certainly relative to what their parents and grandparents lived, certainly relative to what option they had. And, coming out of poverty, their primary focus in life was the material needs of living, of survival. And they've achieved those, and they enjoy those, and that provides them for a relatively good life. So, obviously it's constrained because you're right. There has to be some fear there. There's an element of lack of control about their political fate. But I think I told this story that in 2004, I think it was, when I was first time in China, I was talking to this engineer. I was giving a seminar for an engineering group, and I was talking to this engineer, and I asked him, aren't you bothered by the lack of political freedom? And he said, look, as long as every year, I'm going to get richer. Richer in the sense of I can buy more stuff, I can take care of my family, I can have more opportunities materially. I'm fine. If I don't get to pick between my political leaders. And this was just before, I remember it because it was 2004, because it was just before the election between George Bush and Kerry. And I was like, okay, I get to choose between Bush and Kerry. Or I could have a rising standard of living every year for the next 20 years. What would I prefer? And when you put it in those terms, I can see his perspective, right? And particularly given where they came from. So I wouldn't diminish their ability. I wouldn't think that, I think they can live a decent life, a good life. Not as good as they could in a free society, but okay. Is the uniform praise of Trump from the right a step to barring criticism? Look, I don't think anybody in the Trump administration today, with the exception maybe of Stephen Miller, actually thinks that they want to bar criticism. They would all claim that they are for the First Amendment, and they believe in free speech. And I think they do. And I think, I don't think Trump cares one way or the other. I don't think he believes in free speech. But I think they generally, don't want to stop people from borrowing want to stop borrowing of criticism. But they want to reduce it. They want people to pay a price, at least some price for it. They're not beyond intimidating, particularly at the higher levels, and they will use whatever levers they can in order to do it. America's not ready for the government to bar political criticism. And they know that. Even the Stephen Millers, the real fascists among them, they realize that Americans are not ready to just give it up. So I don't think that's where we're heading anytime soon. All right, these are some of the questions from yesterday, and then we'll get to the questions from today, and we'll wrap it up. Liam, is it a positive sign that Trump is willing to remove a lot of these tariffs? Will he end up doing the same for other failed status policies? Well, it's a positive sign as compared to the alternative where he sticks to bad policy and never reneges on it. So in that sense, it's a positive sign, and it's certainly that he at least pays attention to the market or maybe pays attention to some businessmen. But look, it's not over yet, right? These are all on 90 days postponements. We don't know what happens after 90 days. These trade deals are not good. And like the UK trade deal or the China deal, they were all putting in a position much worse than it was before Liberation Day, before Trump started on this. So we're not advancing. We're not even going back to the status quo. We're going to land up in a worse situation than we were. Now, it is good that Trump is not willing to just plow ahead with policies that are clearly, unequivocally, and dramatically destructive. That's good. And maybe in other places he will wind those down, but it's not clear. Like, nobody's really that upset about what he's doing to immigrants. I am, and a few other people are. But there's no constituency that Trump cares about that is upset about it. And there's no reason for him to withdraw it unless the courts say, no, you can't use the Aliens Enemies Act like this. But short of that, there's no reason for him to draw back because the market's not responding to it. And I think that's true of a lot of his bad policies. There's no constituency that he cares about that is acting against it. In the case of tariff, there is businessmen and markets, bond markets, stock market. In any other place where the effect will be on the stock market or the bond market, we might see him reverse bad policies. But even when he reverses, he doesn't go back to square one. There's still harm that is going to be perpetrated. Liam, are markets waiting for Congress, which happens to be the most dysfunctional part of government so far? I'm not sure what you mean by that. I don't think markets are waiting for Congress. I don't think markets have under any illusion about what Congress might or might not do. I am surprised by how bad this bill that Congress is passing is going to be, by how just the sheer scale of the increase in debt is just staggering. The inability to even cut subsidies for solar panels, as Alex described, is staggering. Will Congress respond negatively to that? I hope so, but it's hard to tell. Will markets respond negatively to that? I hope so, but hard to tell. So I don't know what they would be waiting for. I don't think markets are waiting, although they will respond to bad policies, hopefully. Jesper, randomly met Miles Taylor last week here in Norway. Quite surreal, seems like a nice guy. Miles Taylor, who is nice Taylor? What do you think of him? I don't know who he is. Or if I do know who he is, it's not connecting right now. So sorry, not connecting. Not your average algorithm. When people believe every failure is society's fault, they stop looking for ways to grow without personal responsibility. Real progress becomes impossible. Yes, I'd broaden that to whenever people start believing that any failure is somebody else's fault, and they're never willing to take personal responsibility, they're never willing to actually learn the lessons from the failure, then no growth is possible. And you're kind of guaranteeing future failure. not your average algorithm. It's easy to resent those who succeed. It's harder and much more powerful to be inspired by them and build your own path. Yes, that's what it means to be a first-hander, and that's what it means to really understand the role of success in life. Absolutely. Hopper Campbell, incredible how the dim hypothesis is playing out in our lifetime right before our eyes. I thought this level of rapid decay into dictatorship would be 50 years down the road. Yes, although I warn you that we're not going to be in a dictatorship in 5 years. It's not happening. So, I mean, there's still a lot of resistance, and look at the courts. Look at other people who are suing and who are participating in trying to stop Trump. We're not just there. It's still a decade, 2 decades away, I think. Harper Campbell, when do you think the American sense of life will start kicking in, or is it triggered and switched on already? Well, I don't know. The American sense of life has been in decline. It's not clear that there's anything to kick in. I mean, yeah, I don't know what's left of the American sense of life to kick in. I mean, there's a sense in which the American sense of life needs to be rebuilt, recreated, reestablished. And that needs somebody in the culture to reignite it, to remind people of it, but that has to be done intellectually, and I don't see an intellectual voice out there that can do that. To some extent, conservatives did that a little bit in the past by reminding people about the founding fathers and the principles on which this country was founded. Nobody talks like that anymore. It's gone. Equal to reality. Train and ticket booked for York. See you there. Yeah, looking forward to it. Next Wednesday. Wednesday next week. Brownie. Is the NBA an example of a monopolistic business, even in a free market monopoly on elite basketball players? No, so let me be clear. I don't believe that the term monopoly applies to a business which is basically engaged in collusion here. But it's not monopoly. It's a group of businessmen getting together and setting up, if you will, a new business that dominates the market. But monopoly is something that the government controls, that the government makes possible, and that the government protects. I think you could compete with the NBA. They have been in the past. There was the CBA. There were attempts to compete with it. The fact that those competing enterprises fail doesn't make the NBA a monopoly. I don't like to use the term monopoly. Monopoly relates to a privilege that the government gives you, whereby it protects you from competition. I don't think the government has done that. So I don't use the term monopoly for things that are products of the market. Supercask, first you won't vote for Taylor Swift. Now you won't read my fan fiction. You're breaking my heart, Yaron. I mean, everybody else is paying me to read their fiction. Sorry, I can't make exceptions. Matt, are you planning to watch the Celtics get knocked out tomorrow night? New York is going to go crazy. Knicks haven't been in the conference finals since 2000. Was this written today? Because yesterday the Celtics actually won. I don't know if I'm going to watch the game tomorrow night. I'm at the Opera tomorrow night, so I'll probably miss the game. I'm going to the Opera. I'm here in New York. So I'll probably miss the game. But I wouldn't be surprised if they won tomorrow, if the Celtics won tomorrow. And then I think all bets are off in a Game 7. I think either team could win it in Game 7. But look, Boston is a much better team than New York. It's not even close. Just in terms of sheer talent. I have no idea what happened in Game 1 and 2, why they played so pathetically bad. But that is atypical of them. A typical day, Boston beats New York, no question about it. And even without Jason Tatum, I still think that Boston playing well beats New York playing well. Boston playing poorly will lose, but Boston playing well beats New York playing well, even without Tatum. Will they play well? I don't know. They didn't in the first 2 games. This series should be over by now because they should have won the first 3 games and then yesterday's game, and that was it. There was only one game which New York outplayed them, and that was Game 4. And even there, you know, only in the final quarter did they really outplay them. So it's one of the things that's sad about this series is how much better the Celtics are than New York, and the fact that in spite of that they're losing and probably will lose the series. Michael, and of course what happened to Tatum is just horrible. Not, you know, could happen anytime, but it's really sad. It's really sad. Matt says Knicks in 6, but he also says that I'm correct about the relative, you know, competence of each team. Michael says, why the urge to cut Medicaid if MAGA is a socialist movement? Well, they're not cutting Medicaid. The urge to cut Medicaid is because they can't find anything else to cut. They won't cut subsidies to wind and solar, and even if they did, it's not enough money. They can't cut to Medicare and to Social Security because those are middle-class entitlements. They'd lose too many votes. All they've got left is Medicaid. So Medicaid is an act of desperation, and even then they can't get the votes to do it. So it's not clear that it's even going to happen. It's going to pretend to happen. They're going to cut something, but it won't be real. And you'll see, the government will spend a lot more money in 4 years than it does today. At the end of the Trump administration, as I told you over and over again, in spite of DOGE, in spite of everything, the government will spend a lot more money than it did at the beginning of the year. And you will, even you guys will have to recognize that DOGE was a massive, unmitigated, massive failure. Michael, what are some of the positive things Larry Salzman believes Trump is doing? I think the main thing is that they are going to engage in massive deregulation at the agency level, at the level of the regulatory agency. But it's not going to be things that can be easily reversed because they're going to use court precedences. They're going to use the rulings of the Supreme Court from the last term, for example, overturning a Chevron, to solidify the deregulation. So what Larry was saying is that they've got now a lawyer in each one of these regulatory agencies, basically combing all over everything that the regulatory agency is doing and seeing whether the law, Congress, clearly articulates that the regulatory agency tells them that the regulatory agency can do that. And if it doesn't clearly, then that's an opportunity for deregulation. That's an opportunity to getting rid of whatever rules the regulatory agency has passed. And then if it's challenged in court, then they are relying on the Supreme Court to back them up. And that could be huge. And that is massive, massive. Because so much of the intervention and regulations and controls that exist today are not by Congress, although Congress sets the framework, they're by the regulatory agencies themselves, as in the way they interpret the laws that Congress passed. And if we can get rid of that, those interpretations, that would be huge. Michael, socialism mixed with nationalism is okay with the American people. Socialism mixed with 127 genders, not so much. I think that's right. I think that America is much more likely to be fascist, which is socialism in a sense, right-wing socialism, and nationalist than it's likely to be communist. I've always said the left, and Ayn Rand said this, the left is unlikely to win in America. And that was Leonard Peikoff's conclusion in Honest Parallels and in Dim in the end, is that the left is unlikely to win in America, and it's much more likely to be a right-wing integrated ideology. Supkaski, not surprising, conservatives have been tearing up the Bill of Rights, minus the Second Amendment for some reason. For decades now, they believe rights are privileges. Not even liberals believe that. Yeah, although there is the Privileges and Immunities Clause in the Constitution, so they use privileges. So maybe I'm just not understanding privileges the way it should be. Anyway, I mean, Miller's a bad guy no matter what, but maybe in this case his use of privileges is not what reveals his badness. John Bale says, the Privileges and Immunities Clause prevents state discrimination related to interstate commerce, ensuring equal treatment for out-of-state citizens. Okay, which is, yeah, I mean, it still doesn't tell me how they use the term, in what sense they use the term privilege. And I need to do a little research and think about it. We'll figure it out. Okay, Anne, did objectivist intellectuals write on disparate impact? I don't think so. I spoke about it quite extensively. I did a whole show on this, really digging deep, going back to that Duke case. I did it during BLMs. I did it during COVID. It was a long, deep dive. The whole show was just dedicated to that. It was part of my critique of Kendi and all these other things and the connection between, maybe it was an analysis of Richard Hanania's essay, or part of the analysis of Richard Hanania's essay. But, as far as I know, there's no objectivist. I can't remember Ayn Rand talking about disparate impact. It was 71, she was still writing. So I don't know. Not your average algorithm. Are you going to answer the unanswered questions from yesterday? Yeah, I just did. Supkaski, U.S. conservatives were strong supporters of apartheid South Africa, so they're just coming full circle. I don't know if that's true. Some were, but I think a lot of conservatives were against apartheid, very much against apartheid, but just didn't believe that sanctions were the right approach, and that if we're not sanctioning the Soviet Union, why would we sanction South Africa? So, but I wouldn't categorize as U.S. conservatives as being pro-apartheid. Esoteric dichotomy. The racism from both sides hurts us all. My classmates in my race and law required class were shocked I proposed a colorblind society, given I am mixed. Yeah, it's really, really, really sad how things have changed, I'd say, over the last 15 years, from going from the ideal, universal ideal, universally accepted ideal of colorblindness to hatred of that concept and a complete dedication to this idea of, taking race into account in everything. Arum, would you chat with the knowingless rationalists, somewhat like Ayala? They seem objective adjacent. I don't think they're quite objective adjacent. And Ayala, I think, has a screwed up view of sex. I definitely think she has a screwed up view of sex. Although, I'd rather have her screwed up view of sex than the Christian screwed up view of sex. But are they? Yeah, I mean, I would definitely chat with if they invited me on their platform, I would definitely chat with one of these rationalists. There are a lot of them. They're smart. They're thoughtful on a lot of issues. Ayala is thoughtful on a lot of issues, and it's definitely worth talking to them. And the people who follow them, I think, but I would not call them objectivist adjacent at all. On key philosophical issues, they're not at all on our side. If 5% of the world was aligned with objectivism, it would have a profound positive impact. That seems like a realistic media engineering problem. I don't think it's a media engineering problem. It's an education problem. And an education problem is not media. Media doesn't educate. Media capitalizes on the existing educational mainstream and just promotes what's already embedded in the educational system. It does not create new stuff. It does not really change minds. The media itself is pretty static in terms of changing the world. What changes the world is the fundamental ideas being taught at universities and at schools. And to get 5% of the world to be aligned with objectivism, I mean, it is not a media engineering problem. It's a creation of intellectuals problem. It's a creation of influences problem. It's a creation of educators problem. So what we need are intellectuals, influencers, educators. And we need hundreds of them. And it's creating them, which is the problem. It's not manipulating the media or getting more stuff of ours published in the media. You need a mass of content that only hundreds of intellectuals could produce. And that's the problem we're trying to solve, is how to get more intellectuals. There's no way around it. Neo, with AI and autonomous automation, can Israel manufacturing at a large scale and move away from American dependence? I mean, I think it's very difficult for Israel to manufacture on large scale all the different things that it needs, just because a lot of what it needs is going to sit in stockpiles for years and years until it actually needs it. Now, one would have to think about, and you know, maybe there is a way in which you can automate all that. You could build factories that are ready at the go to produce the kind of stuff that you would need in an emergency, and mothball it and wait, and that certainly is possible, and AI and automation will make that easier. Israel would have to, you know, devote even more resources than it already does to national defense in order to do that, but it's possible. It's very tricky to figure out how to set up, for a small country, how to set up a national defense strategy under the assumption you're going to be alone. You're going to be alone. Very difficult. I mean, Ukraine is facing the same challenge. Now, Ukraine is manufacturing huge numbers of drones by itself, so it has shown that it is capable of doing that. But could you do that with bombs and missiles and all the different variety of different weapon systems that you need? I think it's going to be very difficult. Israel needs allies, and a world without allies for Israel is a pretty sad world. Of a world with people who are now willing to sell them weapon systems. Pretty sad world, but Israel needs allies. It's going to be very difficult for it, given its size, to be able to become completely independent on every weapon system that they need in order to win wars. Arun says, you changed my mind when I saw you on Dave Rubin. Yeah, but hundreds of thousands of people saw me on Dave Rubin. And I changed the mind of maybe, you know, a small number of those. There's only so many hundreds of thousands you can approach, you can get to. There's only a certain number of people who change their minds. And you're not going to get to 5%. 5% of his viewers did not change their minds. And that was a great audience. The Dave Rubin in those days had the best possible audience I could imagine. It was generally a left of center audience that was open to thinking and challenging their views. There's only so much of that audience. So yeah, for a certain number of people, it's just media. But even there, even just to get on media, and remember, Dave Rubin is not like a typical Fox 3-minute interview. That was like an hour or something long sit down. To actually do that on a regular basis and to engage and to get to the 5% number, you would have to have 100 active objectivist intellectuals that were making an impact, writing interesting things, doing interesting stuff in order to attract the Dave Rubins to get them, right? I mean, Rogan will not have me on, but he might have another objectivist intellectual in the future that maybe knows something about MMA or something that Rogan really likes. You've got to offer a variety of different intellectuals, all arguing from the same perspective, but arguing differently and with a different context, so that you can get on all the different shows, so that you can get to 5% of the population. It's not simply, okay, Yaron, how do you change the world yourself by having a media strategy? And, you know, I've tried. I've had lots of media strategies. And, you know, we keep getting on new shows like Destiny, but to actually run a strategy, to go and get media, you just hit brick walls everywhere you go. You know, I have not been successful in doing that. With professionals and marketing teams and all of that, we've tried. This is where I am. hopefully soon 40,000 subscribers. That's it. Not 400,000 subscribers, not 4 million subscribers, not 40 million subscribers. Supercast, this administration is in a sense neo-Nixonian. Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which, I don't know. Trump himself cannot be easily categorized that way because I think, as Greg Salmieri said, Trump is basically just a thug who's been given a lot of political power. Nixon was a pragmatist, but Trump goes beyond pragmatism. Now, the rest of the administration, I don't think is neo-Nixonian because the rest of the administration, like J.D. Vance and Hegseth and others, are real nationalists. They really have an ideology. And that was not the ideology of Nixon. If anything, they are neo Teddy Roosevelt, neo McKinley, neo the kind of Republicans of the late 19th century, early 20th century, who were heavily influenced by progressivism, wanted, were nationalists, believed in tariffs. I think it's much more harkening back to the Republicans of the 19th and early 20th century, the late 19th century, early 20th century, which were not good. The Democrats were much better in those days. The best president, probably by some measures in American history, or certainly post-Founding Fathers, was probably Grover Cleveland, who was a Democrat. And he fought against Republicans like McKinley. So they're going back to their roots in some ways. They're at least more modern roots in nationalism. All right, guys, thank you. Appreciate the support. Thanks to all the super chatters. I will be on again probably on Sunday. Until then, I hope you have a good rest of your week and a good weekend. And I will see you from London on Sunday. Bye, everybody. Thanks again for all the super chatters, the stickers. I didn't thank all the stickers except Arun, who gave $100. But thank you to all the people who did stickers. Really, really appreciate the